Hey TCA students! Today we're going to be looking at solving quadratic equations by factoring. Well, let's look at this first question. Make an equation that has two terms multiplied to equal 0. So in my example, I wrote 16x equals 0. I'm multiplying two things, 16 times some other number. Well, the only other number that will work is 0. X must equal 0 because we know that in order to multiply two numbers to equal 0, one of those numbers must equal 0. That's a very basic concept, but it's a very important one for this lesson. So you're going to make your own equation and put it in the blue box. Make sure you use a different number than I used. Also, be sure to fill in this blank over here. I want to do a few examples for you in solving equations by factoring. Let's look at number 2. We see a minus 2 is in parentheses. That means it's an expression of its own being multiplied by another expression, a plus 7. Since there's nothing in between those parentheses, that means we're multiplying. We know that one of those expressions must equal 0 in order for them to multiply together to equal 0. There will actually be two answers to this problem because I could make the a minus 2 equal 0. If I add the 2 to both sides, I see that a must equal 2, which makes sense because 2 minus 2 is 0. If I had 0 in that parentheses, it doesn't matter what I have in the other parentheses. It's going to multiply to a 0. In this case, if a is a 2, the other parentheses will add up to 9. 0 times 9 will be a 0, so that works. But I have another option. I could also make the second quantity equal 0, the a plus 7. In order to solve that, I will subtract the 7 from both sides. And that gives me a equals negative 7. So that would give me negative 7 plus 7 in that second binomial, which is 0. The first one, if a is negative 7, is a negative 9. Doesn't matter. Whatever it is, if I multiply it times 0, the two are going to multiply to give me a quantity of 0. So my answer is a equals 2 or a equals negative 7. Let's look at number 4. Again, I have two quantities multiplied together to equal 0. The first quantity is the 5x minus 2. The second one is the x minus 7. So I'm going to start with the 5x minus 2. If the 5x minus 2 is equal to 0, then it doesn't matter what the other quantity is in the x minus 7 parentheses. I'm going to get a 0 when I multiply. So to solve this, I'm going to add 2 to both sides, which gives me 5x equals 2. Then I need to divide by 5. So x equals 2/5. Or you can make that a decimal of 0.4. Now I want to see what is my other option. My other option is the x minus 7 could equal 0. If I add the 7 to both sides, x equals 7. So I again have two possibilities. X could equal 2/5 or x could equal 7. In these two examples that I just did, the terms were already factored. They had already broken them down into binomials that multiplied together. But in the last section, starting with number 8, you have polynomials that have not been factored yet, so you're going to have to factor them before you try to solve them. So let's look at number 8. Always check for a greatest common factor. I've got a 7, a 35, and a 28. Is there a number that goes into all three of those? Yes, 7 goes into all of those. So my greatest common factor is 7. Notice there is not an x in all three terms, so I cannot pull out an x. I'm going to pull the 7 out, and then I'll see what is left in the polynomial. First term has an x squared left. The second term was a 35, so I need to think, what times 7 is 35? 7 times 5 is 35. So when I put the second term in the parentheses, I have both the 5 and the x remaining in that term after I take the 7 out. For the third term, I had a 28, which is 7 times 4. So since I took the 7 out, all that I have left is the 4. And we were adding for that term, so I'm going to do plus 4. So I'm not finished yet. I need to factor again. Looking at the parentheses, I want to see how can I factor again. I need two numbers that multiply to positive 4 and add up to negative 5. So if I look at that 4, I can do 4 times 1 or 2 times 2. The 4 and the 1 will give me a 5. So I'm going to have x and x to get my x squared, 4 and 1. And I want them both to be subtracting, because if they're both subtracting, I'll multiply to a positive 4, and I will add up to that negative 5. So now I'm ready to try to solve the equation. I actually have 3 terms being multiplied in this one. I have the 7 is one term. Then I have the x minus 4 as a second term. And my third term is the x minus 1. If any one of those is a 0, I will get 0 when I multiply the 3 together. Well, this first term, that 7, it can never be a 0. It's a 7. I can't change that. So I'm not going to worry about it. It just needs to stay out there when I'm factoring, but it's not going to give me an answer for my x. So I'm going to look at the second term. If I set that equal to 0, it is possible to get an x of 4. If x was 4, that quantity in the parentheses would give me a 0. That's one of my answers. Now I go to the third term, the x minus 1. Could it equal 0? If I add that 1 to both sides, I get x equals 1. My two answers are x equals 4 or x equals 1. So you have 2 days, Thursday and Friday, this week to finish the rest of the problems on this worksheet. Have a great day. Miss you all.